In the previous part, Martin went through sculpting the cavern. Again, like last time, I'll start with a breakdown of what to expect in this section and some of the key tools and ideas used. We'll start with a second pass over the large base object where we'll isolate what we have selected using the slash key on the numpad. Then we'll take a look at using the Boolean modifier. We'll be smoothing the object, then enabling auto smooth normals and pulling up our edges menu with the Control E shortcut to get the mark sharp option, which will get our nice sharp edged shading working. We can alt right click to select the edge loop and use J to connect vertices. Then it's on to creating the base trays and then the ForceField Base feet. We can invert selection with Control I. We can use Shift Z when scaling to lock the Z axis while still scaling on the X and Y axis. We'll use Alt S for the shrink fatten tool to bring the feet out further and curve the feet top. We'll use a Boolean to flatten the bottom of the foot and use Dissolve to get rid of extra edges. Then we'll make the upper part of the force field. There we can add a fan of triangular faces with the Poke Face tool. Then we'll make the main force field object. Sometimes it's easier to show the wireframe on our object, and we'll also be using the Boolean modifier again. When snapping, we can automatically merge vertices with an option in the header bar, and we can grow selection by pressing Ctrl and numpad plus. We'll mirror the top half, extrude in the groove, and disabling loop slide will work for a better, more even bevel in this case. We can slide edges by pressing G twice, and then we'll complete the mechanical arms. We can use the L key to select connected faces under the cursor, and we can reset the 3D cursor position with Shift C. Something else we can do is calculations right within those input fields. So that's a quick overview, but now it's over to Martin to demonstrate all that and get right into the details.
So I'm still in sculpting mode. I'm going to go back to object mode, and I'm going to press Shift Space to bring back the properties panel, and then T to bring up the tools panel, and then I'm going to press N to bring back the properties shelf, and I'm going to switch off matte cap and go back to the standard solid shading mode. Next I'm going to move to layer 2, which is the layer with the machine on it, and what I'm going to do is begin from the bottom and then just work up the machine, refining the geometry and adding details that I can see in the concept. So I'm going to begin by working on the large base object at the bottom of the machine, and everything else is parented to it, but that's okay. I can just hide everything and work on each part individually. As an alternative to hiding with the Shift H shortcut, what I can do is instead press the / on my keypad, and that will isolate the selected object and allow me to work on it with an uncluttered view. So I'm going to press 5 on my number pad to go back into ortho view, and now I want to look back at the concept and find out what I need to do with this object. So looking at the object in the concept, there are a few features that I'm going to talk about. The first is obviously these large square shapes that have been carved into it, these kind of indentations, and they almost look like trays, and we've got a rock sample sitting on one of these. And looking at the wider concept, the samples are taken by this claw from the conveyor belt and then placed on this tray, while the one ahead of it in the queue, as it were, is being analysed in the force field area. And then when that one's being analysed, that will be placed on this tray. So it's kind of like an in tray, out tray system. So I want to definitely include these features and include these kind of tray objects that protrude out here. And also the object as a whole seems to have this kind of quite large bevel going all the way around it, and it's also kind of flared at the bottom here. So bearing all of that in mind, I want to go back to the object in Blender and start shaping it. Okay, first I want to make the object flared, so I'm going to tab into edit mode and then Control tab into face mode, and then select this large face on the underside. And before I begin scaling it, I've still got proportional editing enabled, so I want to switch that off. And then I can scale this to flare the object out. I'm just going to put it to somewhere like that. And now I don't need this large face, so I can press X and delete it. Next I want to create a loop cut all the way around the object, so I'm going to press Ctrl R and then click and right click to leave it in the center. Okay, next I want to work out how large these indentations need to be. And what I'm going to do is create a cube and then use that to cut that shape out of the base object. So I'm going to go into object mode and then press / to bring the rest of the machine back. And I'm going to use the base of the force field generator as a general guide. So I'm going to shift select that and then press / again and then go back to my ortho view. And then I'm going to make a new cube, so Shift A, Mesh, Cube. And I want to bring this forwards to somewhere like that, so it overlaps the edge of this larger object. And then I want to look back at the concept. I think the back edge of this indentation is fairly close to the base of this object. But in this case, the object in the end will be flared inwards. As you can see here, it's got a bit of a flare to it. And at the moment, the blockout version has straight edges. So the amount of clearance between the back of this cube and the bottom edge of this base, if anything, it could be a bit closer. So I'm just going to pull this forwards a little bit, and I want it to still be overlapping the edge of the object. So I think something like that's okay. As far as its width is concerned, I think it's roughly about right at the moment. There's a fair amount of the curve of this object to the left of this edge, and it'll be symmetrical, so it'll be the same on the other side. And looking back at the scene, I think what I've got is fairly close there, so I'm going to go with that. Okay, I want to go into my front view, and I want the bottom of this cube to be resting on the new edge that I cut in the center of this base. So I'm going to tab into edit mode and drop my selection, and then control tab and then choose vertex, and then select the verts at the bottom, and then I can hold control and click on the blue arrow and then snap those to the center line. Okay, back in solid view, I actually want two of these cubes. I want another one here, so I'm going to duplicate this and rotate it around the 3D cursor. So changing my pivot point to 3D cursor, I'm going to press Shift D and then R and then Z and then -90. So I've now got these two cutting objects, but I want to combine them together to keep it all simple. So I'm going to shift select both of them and then choose join from the tools tab. Okay, going back to my base object, I'm going to use a Boolean modifier to do the cutting. So I'm going to go to my modifier panel and then choose Boolean. And then to select my cutting object, I'm going to use this eyedropper and select my cubes. And as before, it's defaulted to intersect, but I can just change that to difference. So I'm going to temporarily hide this cutting object. I'm going to be using it later on for the tray objects that protrude out of the base. So I'm going to hide those, and you can see that the shapes have been cut in quite nicely to this base object. So selecting it again, I'm going to press apply and get rid of the modifier. The next thing I want to do is create this bevel that goes around the top of this object. So I'm going to press Shift H and hide the base object there, and then tab into edit mode and then control tab for face mode, and then select this large face at the top. Next I'm going to press Control B for bevel and then just bring that down, and I can hold Shift to refine it, keep it under control, and then I'm going to place that about there. And if I want to, I can resize my options area at the bottom of the tool shelf and make some changes numerically, but I think that's okay. Okay, the next thing I want to do is start introducing proper smoothing onto this object. And if I go into object mode, I'll show you what I mean. So far, all of the objects have this kind of faceted shading, and as well as refining the geometry in this step, I also want to start bringing in proper smoothing and make it look more machine-like and rounded. So the first thing I want to do is go into my tool tab and then click on the smooth shading button, and that will create this quite ugly effect because I've got quite a few n-gons and strange geometry that needs cleanup. But before I go ahead and start adding sharp edges, the next thing I need to do is come over here to the object data context and enable this option for auto smooth, and that will allow the viewport to show both hard and soft edges on the object. So next I want to go into edit mode again, and I'm going to select this large face at the top and then press Ctrl E for the edge menu and then mark sharp. And you can see if I drop my selection, I've now got this kind of turquoise green line going around the entire face, so all of the edges are shown to be sharp edges. So continuing on then, I want to make some of the other edges hard, and if I Control Tab into edge mode, I want to select this edge loop that goes all the way around the bottom of this bevel I've just made. So I can hold Alt and then right click on one of the edges, and it goes around the entire object, selecting the entire edge loop, and then I can press Control E again and then mark those as sharp. And next I want to go into this indentation area and select some of these edges, the ones in the corners, the ones down here, like that, and then press Control E again, mark sharp, and then do the same at the other tray area. And then mark sharp. So if I go back into object mode, you can see now I've got this kind of nice smoothing going around this object, and it looks a lot more machine-like, I think. But in these tray areas, I've still got this kind of pillowing effect where I've got this the edges being smoothed, and that's because the faces that make up the bottom of these trays are going to be deleted. So if I go back into edit mode again and then Control Tab into face mode and select those faces, I can press X and delete them, and going back into object mode, you can see that because those edges are now open, they automatically become hard edges. So as a whole, the object looks nicely smoothed. So going back into edit mode, I have a bit of geometry here that needs cleaning up. The top of the object is obviously still this very large n-gon, so I need to break that up into either triangles or quads, and it's generally good practice to do that. If you have n-gons, that can lead to problems with shading and lighting and so on. So in the end, I want this object to be composed only of triangles or quads. So I'm going to begin by dropping my selection. I'm going to go down here to the tray areas and then Control Tab into vertex mode, and I'm going to select this vertex and then the one at the opposite corner, and then press J, which will connect them together with this edge. So now I've got a triangle and a quad rather than an n-gon. And so I'm going to do the same on the other side, and then work around to the other tray area and do the same. Okay, now I'm ready to tackle this large n-gon at the top, and I'm going to begin by connecting these corners together, and then I'm going to connect these, and in this case it's created a polygon here that looks almost triangular, but it is actually a four-sided face. There's a small edge there, so that's okay. And I'm going to do the same on the other side, and then I'm going to select these three verts and press J again, and that will break that up into triangles. Okay, next I'm going to select these two and make a large quad there, and I'm going to do something similar on this side that I did on that side and create a triangular shaped quad there, and I'm going to keep it symmetrical, do the same on the other side of the object. And then for the rest of it, I'm just going to work up this large face and break things up into quads or triangles. So if I select these opposite vertices and connect them all the way up, it's making these long thin quads. And then I'm left with a small triangle at the end there. So going back into object mode, the object is nicely smoothed, and it's also got good topology, and I don't have any n-gons. Next I'm going to press Alt H to bring my other objects back, and I'm going to repurpose this cutting object to become the trays that stick out of this base object. And looking back at the concept, they protrude a little bit there, but there's also kind of a bevel shape on the underside. So I'm going to represent that. I'm going to go into edit mode and then Control Tab into face mode and drop my current selection. And then I can select these two top faces and then move them down to something like that. And then I want to select the bottom edges here. So I'm going to press Control Tab, go into Edge mode, and select that edge, and then that one. And then I'm going to zoom in so I can see a bit more clearly, and press Control B, and then just bevel that edge a little bit. Okay, there are some faces inside that I don't need anymore, so I'm going to press Control Tab and go back into Face mode. And the face on the back of each of these objects I can safely delete, I think. And then I can press X to delete them. And here I've got some n-gons now, so I want to connect some of these vertices together to clean that up. So I'm going to Control Tab into vertex mode and then select those, and the same on the other side. And then I want to do the same on the other tray. Okay, now I want to go into object mode, and with that one still selected, I want to shift select my machine base, and then I want to click join. Okay, so now that's all one object, and I think it looks pretty close to what's going on in the concept. Next, I'm going to work on the base of the force field generator, and as I mentioned before, it's kind of flared inwards here, and I also need to add these feet. So I'm going to go ahead and select the object, and as before I've got a face on the underside, so I'm going to go into edit mode and then face mode, and then select that face, and then I can scale that in. I'm just going to eyeball it again, make it somewhere around there, and now I don't need that face anymore, so I can press X and delete it. And what I want to do here is create some bevels, and looking back at the concept, there's a bevel going around this large section at the bottom, and I think there's another one there on the section just below the rim that supports the force field. So I'm going to add those in first. I'm going to go back into edge mode, and I'm going to hold Alt and then right click on this edge, and then I'm going to press Control B and just bring that into somewhere like that. And bevels are good on this kind of object because it looks a bit more mechanical, but also it helps to kind of catch the light and give you interesting highlights. So I'm going to go back to this top area and then hold Alt and then right click on that edge, and then I'm going to press Control B again, and I'm going to bring that one down to not quite that far, somewhere like that. Okay, next the rim that supports the bottom of the force field, that's got quite a bevel on it as well, so I'm going to go in and add that. So again, pressing Alt and then clicking on one of the edges to select the entire edge loop, I can go in and press Control B, and that's quite a bit bigger. I think it's something like that. Okay, so as before, I now want to set up my smoothing for this object. So I'm going to first of all go back into object mode and then click on the smooth button, and then over here in the data context I'm going to enable auto smooth, and as before I'm going to go back into edit mode and then select the edge loops that I want to be hard edges. So I'm going to drop my selection, and I think most of them need to be hard edges actually, so I'm going to hold Alt and then right click on one of these and select the edge loop, and then holding Shift I'm going to do the same with that one and that one and that one. In fact, pretty much all of them. So now I can press Control E and then choose Mark Sharp. So when I go back into object mode, you can see it's got this much nicer, kind of smoother look to it, and it makes it look a lot nicer in fact. Okay, the next thing I want to do is create these feet that support the whole machine really. So what I'm going to do is select some faces from the base object and then extrude those shapes out. So going into edit mode, I'm going to Control Tab into face mode, and I want to select some faces from this part here that line up with the y-axis. So I'm going to switch my grid floor and my grid lines back on, my axis lines rather, and I want to select the central 4 faces that line up with this y-axis line. So I'm going to select those ones and then duplicate them with Shift D and then right click to leave them in place, and then press P to bring up the separate menu and then separate that selection off into its own object. So now I can select that object and it's just this strip of geometry. You may remember from before when we grouped all of the machine geometry together and made the base object be the parent, and this object that I've just made is part of that parental group. So if I move this object around, it will take that strip of geometry with it, and in this case I don't actually want that to happen. So I'm going to select the object again and then press Alt P and then clear the parent. And the reason I've done that is because I temporarily want to rotate this base object 45 degrees, so that when I start extruding the foot geometry out of this this object here, I'm not going to be protruding and sort of hanging over the top of this indentation. So I'm going to select my base object and then rotate it 45 degrees, so R, Z, 45. So now when I select it again, I can extrude out and it'll be resting on this bit of floor. So I'm going to go into edit mode, and before I begin extruding I want to strip away some of the geometry. It's a bit too wide, so I'm going to press Ctrl R and then divide this face into 2 by right clicking and leaving the cut in the center, and then do the same on the other side. And this time I also want to place one at the top and then slide it up a little bit, so I'm going to press Ctrl R again and get the horizontal cut, and then click and drag it up to somewhere near the top. And if you look back at the concept, the top of this foot, it's got a bit of a curve to it, but it does reach almost near the top of this lower segment of the base object. So next I want to Control Tab into face mode and select these central faces, and then Control I to invert the selection, and then X to delete those outer faces. So now I can press A and select all of the remaining faces, and then I can press E to extrude, and it will extrude them down. I want to extrude them to about there, so that the end of the foot still has a bit of height to it. And at the moment it's still a bit too wide and I want it to be kind of tapered. So I'm going to move my gizmo back to median, so I'm going to change my pivot point from 3D cursor to median, and I want to scale them on the X and Y. So I'm going to press S and then Shift Z to lock the Z axis out, and I want to bring them in a little bit so that there's a bit of clearance between the edge of this object and the corner of this indentation. And looking back at the concept, I think these come out a bit further than what I've got now. So I want to press Alt S to bring them out a bit further, something like that. And if they encroach too far onto that corner, I think it's a little bit too close, I'm just going to scale that back down in the same way. So I'm going to press S and then Shift Z and just bring those in, something like that. And now because I've pulled it down even further, I don't think it's really high enough there, so I'm just going to pull that up a little bit, something like that. Now I want to give the top of this a bit of a curve, and I can do that by selecting these 2 central faces at the top and then pressing Alt and S, and I can hold Shift because it's quite a small movement I want to make. I want to place it so the central line is almost near the top of that object, and then I can select the outer faces and then press Alt S again, and again holding Shift I can bring those down to make that curve a bit neater all the way along. Okay, so now I've got my object basically in place. If I look back at it in object mode and then hide everything else, you can see that there's a lot of geometry that kind of sticks through the base object that it's sitting on. I want it to have a flat edge at the bottom, so I'm going to use a Boolean to slice along this object. So I want to create a cube. I'm going to press Shift A and then go Mesh Cube, and I want the cube to be larger than the foot so I can do a proper cut. So I'm going to move it down and I'm going to go into my side view and wireframe, and I want the top vertices of this cube to be lined up with the back corner of this object. So I'm going to tab into edit mode and then drop my selection, and then control tab into vertex mode and select those vertices, and then holding control I can just click on the blue arrow and then snap it to that corner. And then back in object mode I can move this object along and have it so that it encompasses the footprint of the foot. So going back into an ortho view and then framing my selection with my decimal point key on my keypad, I can go into solid view, and then I want to select the foot and then come over here to my modifiers and choose Boolean, and then I'm going to use the eyedropper again to select my cube and again change my operation to difference. So if I now apply that modifier, I can delete my cube and it's giving me this nice clean surface on the underside of the foot. Okay, so looking at it in edit mode to see what it's done with the geometry, there's a bit of cleanup I need to do. So I want to go into edge mode with control tab, and I'm going to select these angled edges it's created and just check around the object. There's another one there. And I want to dissolve these edges, so I'm going to press X and then choose dissolve. And this face on the underside I don't need, and I also don't need these faces at the back, so I'm going to control tab into face mode again and then select them and then select one underneath, and then I can press X and delete them. Okay, so now I want to give this some smoothing. If I look at it in object mode, it's a bit soft and doesn't look very nice, and I want it to match up more neatly with the other objects I've currently got. So next I want to change the smoothing on this object to match the other base objects, and I'm going to do that in the same way. I'm going to tab into edit mode and I want to select these edges. So I'm going to go into edge mode and then select the edges here and here, and I'm also going to select this edge and this edge at the corners, and then I'm going to apply a bevel on those as well, so control B and then holding shift to keep control, I'm going to bevel that down to, let's say, about there. Okay, I'm now going to mark some of these edges as sharp. So what I'm going to do, I've still got all of this selected, so instead of deselecting and then selecting each edge individually, most of these I want to be sharp. So I'm going to press Control E and mark sharp, but then I want to select the edges here and I want them to not be sharp. So I'm going to go Control E and then clear sharp. So let's just check it in object mode. Yeah, that's not too bad. So I'm going to press Alt H to bring my other objects back, and I think that fits in quite well with the base objects. Okay, so now that I've done that, I can select my machine base object, the large base object at the bottom, and I want to rotate that back. So I'm going to press RZ -45. And the foot object actually needs to be rotated 45 degrees. So I'm going to select it and I'm going to do RZ -45. And looking back at the concept, I think there are 4 feet. So going back in, I'm going to duplicate this and then make copies that go around the base of the force field generator. So I'm going to press Shift D, RZ 90, and then press Shift R a couple of times, and that will create all of the feet that I need for the object. For the force field object, I don't need to do any beveling, I just need to make the object smooth and remove the faces at the top and the bottom. So back in Blender, I'm going to press / to bring everything back, and then isolate it with / again. And then I'm going to tab into edit mode and then go into face mode and select the faces at the top and the bottom and then delete them. And next I can go back into object mode and then click the smooth button. Going on up the machine then, I'm going to bring back the rest of the geometry, and I'm going to work on the cap for the force field generator. So I'm going to isolate that, and then I'm going to go back to the concept. And in this case, I don't think there are any bevels on this object. It does have this kind of highlight visible, so I am actually going to add a bevel to be more consistent with the base object and also create a more interesting silhouette. So I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to add a bevel to the top and bottom edge of this large section. So I'm going to go into edge mode and then alt click this edge loop, and then shift alt click the one at the bottom, and then press Ctrl B. And I'm going to bring that down to about there. And again, looking back at the concept, I think this top section has a bit of a flare. It kind of tapers inwards. So I want to represent that. I'm going to alt and right click the edge loop there, and I'm going to go into my front view and then scale that down, just to again add a bit more interest to the silhouette. And next I've got this large n-gon at the top, and I want to break that into triangles. So I can press Ctrl Tab, go into face mode and select that large face. And if I press Ctrl F for the face menu, there's an option here called Poke Faces, which I can get to by pressing Alt P. And that will create a vertex in the center of the face and then connect all of the other vertices to it and break it all into triangles. So with that done, I can go back to my edge mode and then Alt and right click on the edge loop at the top. And I'm going to bevel that one as well. So Ctrl B, and then just bring that down to about there. Okay, now I want to mark some sharp edges. So I'm going to Alt and right click and then Shift and Alt and right click the edge loops I want to mark sharp, and then press Ctrl E and mark sharp. So this time I created the sharp edges before I did the smoothing on the object, and that's okay. I can just go back to object mode and click the smooth button, and then in the object data context I can enable the auto smooth option. Next I'm going to bring the rest of the objects back with my / key, and the next part is this lower section of the central column. So I'm going to isolate that, and this one will be quite straightforward. I'm just going to delete the faces at the top and the bottom and then smooth it and make this central edge loop to be sharp. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then face mode, select the faces and delete them, and then I can go into edge mode and Alt and right click on this central edge and then press Ctrl E and mark sharp. And then back in object mode I can click the smooth button and enable auto smooth. The next part is this large central section of the column, but I'm actually going to leave that for now. If you look back at the concept, there's quite a bit of detail that needs to be added to this to make these groove sections. So I'm going to smooth the rest and deal with that first, and then come back and add those details. So selecting the next section up, I'm going to isolate it. And again, this one's quite simple. So I'm going to go into edit mode and face mode, select the faces at the top and the bottom, and then delete them. And then I can just go back into object mode and click the smooth button. Okay, for the next one, this section up here, if I go back to the concept again, I think there's a bit of a flare in this area. So I'm going to taper that in, and I'm going to isolate it first and go into face mode. I'm going to go into my front view and then just scale that down to about there. And now I can delete that face. But with this other face, I need to break it up into triangles as I did before. So I can poke the face by pressing Alt and P. And now I can go into edge mode and Alt and right click the edge loop. And now I can bevel that. Ctrl B. Something like that. And now I can select these edges with Alt and right click and then Shift, Alt and right click, and then press Ctrl E and mark sharp. And as before, go back to the object mode and then click on the smooth button and enable auto smooth. Okay, for the final part then, this large area at the top, it's basically the same process. So I can go into edit mode, Control Tab into face mode, select the face at the top and delete it. And then I need to break up this face into triangles. So select that and then press Alt and P. And then I can Control Tab into edge mode, select the edge loop at the bottom, and I'm going to bevel that one as well. something like that, I think. And again, select those edge loops, and then press Ctrl E and then mark sharp. Going back into object mode, I can click the smooth button and enable auto smooth. So bringing all of the objects back, I think it's all looking quite nice now. I'm going to go back to the central section next and create those grooves which support the ring sections. So to begin working on this, I'm going to select the object and also this torus, and then I'm going to isolate those and go into my front view and wireframe. And the first thing I want to do is make sure that this torus is in the exact center of this larger object. So I'm going to select it and go into edit mode, and I'm going to cut an edge loop in the center of this object. So I'm going to press Ctrl R and then click and then right click to leave that in the middle. And now if I zoom in, you can see that the torus is almost at halfway, but I want to snap it to that new edge. So I'm going to go into object mode and select it, and then hold Ctrl and then click and snap it to the center. Looking back to the concept again, I'm going to say that this horizontal groove that goes around the object is about as deep as the torus itself. So with that in mind, I'm going to go back to the object and go into edit mode, and I'm going to bevel this edge. So I'm going to press Ctrl B, and then I'm going to scale it up so that it basically matches the width of the torus. And I can change it numerically if I want to get it a bit more exact. So I'm going to change that to let's say 0.13, and yeah, I think that will do. I think that this vertical groove is actually more narrow than the horizontal one, so what I'm going to do is make this cylindrical strut that supports the torus, and then I'm going to use that as a guide to decide how wide to make it. So I'm going to go back into object mode, and I want to make a new cylinder in the center here. So I'm going to press Shift A and then choose Mesh Cylinder, and I want it to face my current view, so I'm going to choose Align to View, and I'm going to change the vertices value to 8. And next I want to make it much smaller, so I'm going to change the radius to, let's try 0.1. And zooming in, I want it to be within these two edge loops, here and here, on the torus. And so I'm going to change the radius again to something a little bit smaller, so try 0.09. And yeah, I think that will do. So going back into my perspective view, I just want to move this object out a little bit. And right now I don't mind too much about the positioning of it. If I go back to the concept, I'm going to be shaping this object and placing it more properly later on. But for now I just want to use it as a guide for this vertical groove. Looking at the edge of this groove, it's actually quite close to the edge of this cylinder I've just made. And another thing to notice is the curvature of the top part of the groove here. In other situations, I would duplicate the cylinder I've just made and then place that up at the top and then use that as a guide to start cutting the central column. But in this case, I don't think that'll be quite round enough. For this strut, I think 8 sides for that cylinder is enough. It's not a very prominent object. But up here, I want a bit more roundness. So I'm going to make another cylinder that's got more sides, and then scale it up to be slightly bigger than the one I've just made, and then place it at the top and then use that to cut into the column. So going back into my front view and wireframe, I'm going to repeat the same process to create a new cylinder. I'm going to press Shift A and then do Mesh Cylinder and Align to View, and I want to increase the vertices to, let's try 12. I think that's okay, and I want to make it slightly larger. So I'm going to change the radius to 0.125. And yeah, I think that will do. Okay, now I need to position this near the top of the central column object. And I'm just going to eyeball this really. I think somewhere like that will be okay. So looking at it back in my solid view, I'm now going to use this cylinder to help me cut into this main object. Next I'm going to shift select the large object at the back, and then press Shift H just to unclutter the view a little bit. And now I want to select the large object and go into my front view and wireframe, and I want to cut a new edge along near the top here to snap to the central vertices in this new cylinder. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then press Ctrl R and then just click and place an edge near where I want it to be. and then I can hold Control and click on the blue arrow and then snap them to the center there. Next I'm going to go back into solid view and select my new object, and I want to select all of the edges that make up the underside, so I'm going to go into edit mode and then go around and select them, and then I can press X and then choose dissolve edges, and that leaves me with this half a cylinder. Next I can Control Tab into face mode and select this face on the underside, and back in my front view I'm going to extrude this down to somewhere like that, and I want to snap this to the top edge loop that makes up the horizontal groove in this object. And to help me visualize this, I'm going to go back to object mode and select my large cylinder, and then come over here to the object context, this orange cube icon, and down here I've got options to show the wire for the object and also draw all edges, so I can now see where I want to snap to. So selecting this object again, I'm going to go back to edit mode and then hold Control and then snap to this edge. Then I'm going to go back into object mode and select my large cylinder again, and I'm going to switch this wire drawing off, and I want to use a Boolean modifier to combine these two objects together, but the smaller object extrudes out of the back of this larger one, and I only want to work at the front. I don't want to have to worry about the back, so I'm going to select this one again and go into edit mode and then select these two faces at the back and then pull those in so that they're inside this larger object. So going back into object mode and selecting the large one, I'm going to go over to my modifiers and choose a Boolean, and this time when I use the eyedropper to select the object, I'm going to change the operation to union. So when I apply it, and I'll just hide this original object, I've now got this extrusion built into this large cylinder. So the next thing I want to do is go into edit mode and clean up some of this geometry. So what I'm going to do is select the vertices that go around this extrusion and snap them back to the main body of the object. So I'm going to press Control Tab for vertex mode, and I'm going to activate my snap for this, and then select each vertex and then press G and then just snap it. Okay, with that done, I'm going to press A to drop my selection, and then A to select all the verts, and then press Ctrl V, and then that'll bring up the vertex menu, and I can choose remove doubles. So with that done, I need to remove a couple of edges here, so I'm going to go to edge mode, and then select this edge, and I've got another edge down here. So when I press X, and then choose dissolve edges, it leaves me with this large polygon. So back in vertex mode, I want to select the vertex in the center at the top there, and then select the central vertex at the bottom, and then press J to connect them together. So now I have this groove cut nicely into my cylindrical object. Next I have a bit of geometry to clean up. I've got some n-gons here, and there's a couple down here as well. So as before, I'm going to select the vertices and then press J to connect them together. And with these top corner areas, I can just select these vertices and do the same thing. Something like that. Going back to the concept for a moment, I want 3 of these vertical grooves to be on this main cylinder, and each one corresponds with one of these horizontal struts that supports the torus. So rather than going through all of those steps to make each groove, I'm going to duplicate this section of the cylinder and then rotate it around to be in the relevant place, and then combine them all into one object. Before I begin that process, I'm going to remove some of the geometry that I don't need. In the end, I'm going to have the top section of this object finished, and I'm going to duplicate it and mirror that across the Z-axis. So I want to put an edge loop in the center of the object, so I'm going to press Ctrl R and then click, and then right click to leave that in the center. But as you can see here, where I've created some triangles, the loop cut tool terminates at a point where it meets a triangle. So I need to connect these vertices together manually, and I can do that just by selecting them and then pressing J again, and it will cut across any edges that are in the way and connect them together. Next, I want to tidy up these small triangles. So I'm going to select this vertex and then snap it to the nearest one. But this time I'm going to use a tool down here called Automatically Merge Vertices. So if I enable that, and I've still got snap enabled from before, if I then press G and then snap it to that nearest vertex, Blender will automatically merge those into one. So that saves the need for selecting all of your vertices and then removing doubles, which can be a real time saver sometimes. So I'm going to go over to the other side and do the same there. Press G. And now I want to go into my front view and Control Tab into face mode and go into wireframe, and then box select all of the faces that make up the bottom half of the object and then delete them. Next, I want to duplicate the faces that make up this groove geometry here. So what I'm going to do is go back to object mode, and I want to use the armatures as a guide to decide where these new bits of geometry need to be placed. So I'm going to go out of my local view and I'm going to select the top parts of each of the armatures and then isolate that selection. So just to show you before I begin, if I select these two faces here in the center, at the moment they are lined up with the y-axis, and to begin with I want to rotate the entire object so that those faces are lined up with the x-axis and also this part of this armature here. So if I go into my top view and then wireframe, I want to rotate the object so that this selection ends up facing in this direction. So I'm going to go back into object mode and then press R -90. And now if I go back to my edit mode, those faces are now aligned with that armature. Okay, next I want to duplicate this object. So I'm going to go back into object mode and then press Shift D and right click to leave it in place. And I'm going to turn snap off for now. And I've got my duplicated object, but if I go into edit mode, I only want to keep the faces that make up this area here. So to select these extra faces outside my current selection, I could shift select each one, but a quick way of doing it in this case would be to press Control and then plus on the number pad, and that will expand the selection outwards. So that's a quick way of selecting all of those faces. And then I can press Control I to select the inverted faces and then delete those. So I now have an object just with this strip of geometry in it, and I want this new strip to line up with the next armature. And I don't know if you remember from before, the number we used to space out the armatures was 123.75 degrees. So if I go into my top view again, and I'm going to do this in wireframe, and if I go into object mode and then press R -123.75, if I zoom in now, you can see that that's nicely aligned with the divisions in the original cylinder, and it's also lined up nicely with the armature there. So if I press Shift D again and then press R -123.75, I've now done the same for this armature down here. Next, I want to combine these new bits of geometry with my original cylinder. I'm going to go back into my solid view and I want to select the cylinder, and if I go into wireframe, what I want to do is go into edit mode and then select these faces that make up this strip of geometry on the original cylinder and then just delete them. So when I go back into solid view, I now have this new strip of geometry which will fill in that blank. So I want to do the same on the other side where the other armature is. So I'm going to select that object to make sure where it is, or if you want you could go back to the object context and turn on the wire for each object, which will help you visualize that. And if I go into edit mode, I can select those faces and then delete them. And then going into object mode, if I shift select these two strips of geometry and then click the join button, I can go into edit mode and then Control Tab into vertex mode and select all of the vertices, and then I can press Control V for the vertex menu and then choose remove doubles. So now I have these three vertical grooves spaced appropriately in the object. Next I want to duplicate this geometry and then mirror that across the Z-axis. to create the bottom half of the cylinder. And before I do that, I want to use my 3D cursor as my reflection point for the mirror process. So I'm going to Alt and right click on one of the edges that make up the bottom edge loop, and then I'm going to press Shift S and then choose cursor to selected, and that will put the cursor in the center of that selection. And next I'm going to press A twice, and then I'm going to change my pivot point down here to 3D cursor. So when I press Shift D and duplicate those faces and right click to leave them in place, I can then press Ctrl M for mirror and then press Z and then press enter. And you may remember from before, during these kind of processes, it tends to flip the normals. So I'm going to press Ctrl F for the face menu and then choose flip normals. Next I want to select this geometry that makes up this groove and extrude it inwards. So I'm going to go into my front view and wireframe, and then in face mode I'm going to drop my current selection, and I'm going to begin by selecting the band of polygons that makes up this horizontal groove all the way around the cylinder. So I'm going to box select those, and then back in my perspective and solid view I'm going to shift select the vertical faces. And next I'm going to press Alt and E to bring up the extrude menu and then choose region vertex normals. And as before, I can hold down Shift to control this movement. And I'm going to put that to somewhere like that. Okay, next I'm going to go into edge mode, and I want to select all of the edges that make up the top of this extruded shape. So I'm going to Alt and right click on one of them, and it won't go all the way around. So I need to add to the selection with Shift and Alt. So I'm going to go around, and with them all selected I can then bevel those. So I'm going to press Ctrl B again and hold Shift, and for the most part it's giving me a pretty decent result. But if you look at the tops of these curves, that's quite nasty. So if I look over here at the options for the bevel, there's a tick box here called Loop Slide, which is on by default. In this case, if I switch it off, I get a much cleaner result. Okay, that's looking okay overall, I think. If we go into object mode, you can see that it hasn't got any smoothing applied to it. And up to now, we've been doing quite simple smoothing, where we've just been selecting edges and then marking them as sharp. But because this object is a bit more complicated, that could get a bit tedious. So there's a slightly more automated way of smoothing objects like this. I'm going to begin by going over to the shading option and enabling smooth shading, and then go over here to the data context and then enable auto smooth. And when I enable that, nothing really changes, and that's because the angle for the auto smooth is set to 180 degrees. So if I change that angle to something lower, it changes the smoothing of the object based on the angle of the faces in relation to each other. So with a low value, it starts introducing some hard edges. So I'm going to change that to 30. And that's given me a pretty good result already. If I'd gone around the object and marked the edges as sharp myself, it would have produced a result like this. But it has left a couple of sharp edges here at the tops of these curves. So I'm going to change this angle again to 35. And that seems to have caught those. I just want to look around the object quickly. And yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, finally for this object, I want to select these edge loops at the top and the bottom and bevel those as well. So I'm going to go back into edit mode, and I'm going to Alt and right click on one of the edges. And because I've got some triangles involved in the geometry now, it's not going to select the entire edge loop in one selection, so I need to press Shift and Alt again, and then add to that selection. And then I want to do the same at the bottom. And now I can bevel those. So I'm just going to bevel it in a little bit. I think that's okay. Alright, for the next part I want to press Ctrl E and bring up the edge menu and mark those edges as sharp. And I actually only want the edge loops to be sharp. But sometimes in these situations it can be quicker to mark everything as sharp and then clear a sharp edge. It really depends on your preferences. But if I drop my selection, I want to select the edge ring, these vertical edges going all the way around. So I can hold Control and Alt and then right click on one of the vertical edges and then bring up the edge menu again with Control E and then clear sharp, and then do the same at the top. So Control and Alt, click on a vertical edge, Control E and then clear sharp. Okay, so looking at it in object mode, I think that's looking pretty good overall. And so yeah, it's time to move on. Next, I'm going to work on the torus, and I'm going to begin by making one of these extra thick joint sections. So I'm going to go out of my local view and then press Alt and H to show all of my objects. And for this next part, I want to use the small cylinder I made earlier as a reference, and I also need the torus and this central column. So I'm going to select those. And this time, I'm not going to use local view, I'm just going to hide the other objects instead with Shift and H. And then I'm going to go into top view and then frame my selection. And I want this small cylinder to be aligned with the x-axis. So I'm going to select that. And my 3D cursor is going to be my rotation point. It's still set to 3D cursor in the pivot point menu. And so I can just press R, -90. And now that's lined up the way I want it. Looking back to the concept again, this joint is really just an inflated section of the torus. So I'm going to begin by duplicating the whole torus and then just selecting some of the faces there and deleting the rest, and then extruding those outwards. So I'm going to select the torus and then duplicate it and leave it in place. And if we go into edit mode, I only want to keep these bands of polygons here in the center. I want to delete the rest. So I'm going to go into face mode and wireframe, and I'm going to draw a box selection, but this time I'm going to use the middle mouse button to create the box. So everything inside it will be deselected. And now I can press X and delete the remaining faces. So now I'm just left with these faces here. So next I want to make this object a bit more narrow, and I'm going to do that by cutting some edge loops in on either side. So I'm going to press Control R, and I'm just going to right click and leave it in the center, because this time I'm going to change the positioning with this factor slider. So if I move this down, you can see the edge moving along the object, and I want to change it to be -0.5. And now I want to do the same on the other side, so Control R and then click, and then right click to leave it in place. And this time I need to move the slider the other way because it's on the opposite side of the object. So I'm going to change that value to 0.5. Okay, so in face mode, I want to remove these bands of polygons at the ends of the object. So I'm going to Alt and right click on them, and then Shift and Alt. And then I can press X and delete those faces. So now in a solid view and back in perspective, I can press A and select all the faces, and I want to extrude those outwards. So I'm going to press Alt and E for the extrude menu, and then choose region vertex normals. And as always, I can hold down Shift and just pull that out a bit more slowly. Something like that, I think. Okay, now I want to select the central edge loop. So I'm going to go to edge mode and then Alt and right click on it. And I want to scale it up, but at the moment my pivot point is set to 3D cursor. So I'm going to change that back to median, and then I can press S and just scale that up. So next I want to bevel this edge. So again I'm going to press Control B and then bring that down to something like that. And I want to add another segment to make it a bit more round. So I'm going to change that to 2. And now I have this more rounded kind of object. Okay, so next I want to go back to object mode, and I'm going to hide everything else for a moment, because on the inside of this object there are some faces that I don't need. So I'm going to go into face mode, and I'm going to Alt and right click, and then Shift Alt and right click on these interior faces, and then delete them. Okay, so back in object mode, this is still faceted, so I need to apply some smoothing to it. I'm going to click the smooth button, and as before, I'm going to come over here to the data context and enable auto smooth. And I want to select these edges at the ends of the objects and make them sharp edges. So I'm going to go back into edge mode and then select those edge loops, and then press Control E and mark sharp. And while I'm here, I'm going to make it so that the edge is slightly angled here. So I'm going to Alt and right click and just select one of the edge loops, and I'm going to press G twice, and that will allow me to slide the edge along the normals of the adjoining edges. You can see as I move the edge around, it kind of flows with the edges that surround it. So if I move it to about here, and it gives me a factor value, so I'm going to change that to something a bit easier to remember. I'm going to change that to negative 0.1, and now I'm going to do the same on the other side. I'm going to select that edge loop and then press G twice and just click, and now I can change this to negative 0.1. So now the object is symmetrical. Okay, so I'm going to press Alt H and bring everything back, and now I have this object, and I think it matches pretty well what's going on with the concept. Next I want to work on this horizontal strut that I made earlier, and you can see in the concept it's got this kind of narrow section in the middle with these angle sections on either end. So first of all I'm going to go into wireframe and change the length of this cylinder. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then drop my selection and then go into vertex mode and then select the vertices at the far end, and I'm going to pull those forwards so that they're just inside the central column, and then I can press Ctrl I and invert my selection and then bring those vertices back along the X so that they're just inside the object we've just finished. Okay, next I want to go into object mode and hide everything else, because there are some faces at either end of the cylinder and I want to get rid of those. So I'm going to go into edit mode again and then face mode, and I've still got this face selected from before, so I can shift select the one at the other end and then delete them. So going back into object mode and then unhiding everything with Alt and H, I now want to divide this object up to create my narrow section. So I'm going to go back into edit mode and then press Ctrl R and then page up to add two sets of edges, and then click and then right click to leave them in the center. I want to scale these out a little bit more on the X axis, so I'm going to press S and then X and then bring them out to about there. And now I want to go into face mode and wireframe, and I want to box select the central faces, and then I want to extrude those inwards, so I'm going to press Alt E and then choose region vertex normals, and then using shift again I'm going to bring that down so I've got this narrow section. So in edge mode I want to select the edge loops at the end of these thicker sections, and so I'm going to shift Alt select them, and I want to scale those on the X axis, so I'm going to press S and X again and then just bring that down so I've got this kind of angled shape. Okay, so while I'm here I'm going to add some sharp edges. I'm going to select these edge loops at the ends of the narrow section, so I'm going to add to that selection and then press Ctrl E and then mark sharp. So I'm going to go back into object mode now and click the smooth option, and then in the data context enable auto smooth. Next I'm going to take these two objects and duplicate copies of them around the torus. So I'm going to shift select them and hide everything else and go into my top view. And now I want to go back to ortho, and I want to duplicate these and rotate them around the 3D cursor. So I'm going to change my pivot to 3D cursor, and then as before I want to press Shift D and then press R negative 123.75, and then I can press Shift R to duplicate that process. And now when I go back to my ortho view and press Alt H to bring everything back, my duplicates should be sitting nicely within the grooves on the central column. So next I want to work on the armatures, and I'm going to work on the one that's lined up with the X axis. So I'm going to select the parts I want to work with and hide everything else, and then I'm going to go into my front view, and you may remember from before we kind of posed this, so I want to zero out these rotations and make it all lay out in a straight line along the axis. So I'm going to select each one and just zero out the values in the properties shelf. Okay, and now I'm going to check the concept and decide what I need to do with it. So looking at the armature in the concept, there are these extra shapes, there are these kind of circular shapes like rivets and washers and so on. And what I'm going to do is work through each piece in turn and process the geometry, create some sharp edges, and add these extra features where I think they're appropriate. And some of this stuff may get added in the textures. I'm thinking this one, this circular piece that meets the torus, I think is more likely to be part of a texture. Whereas the joint here is a bit more extruded out, it looks a bit more 3D to me. And also I think this one possibly as well. So I'll be working through each one and adding those features in. Okay, so I'm going to work on each piece in turn. I'm going to start with the upper armature piece and I'm going to isolate that. And looking at it in edit mode, I've got quite a bit of geometry here that I don't really need anymore. So I'm going to select these edges that connect these two circular areas. I'll do it on both sides. And then I can press X and dissolve those edges. And it's leaving these vertical edges connecting the vertices on either side of the object, and that's what I want, but I want to connect the other vertices together in the same way. So I'm going to go into vertex mode and I'm going to select two vertices and then press J to connect them together. And then I'm just going to go around the object and repeat that process with all of these vertices to break up any n-gons I have. And I could have split this object in half and done it on one side and mirrored it, but there aren't many vertices here. It should be a fairly quick process to go around the whole object. Okay, with that done, I want to go back to edge mode and I want to select the main edges going around the whole object on both sides. So I'm going to Alt and click and then Shift and Alt to add to the selection. And with them selected, I'm going to bevel them. So Control B again and Shift again. And I'm going to do something like that. And if I just go into front view, you can see that the distribution of the polygons in the bevel has been disrupted a little bit by this new topology that I've added. So as before, I can deactivate the loop slide option in the bevel options, and that will give me a nice even distribution all the way around the object. So go back into object mode. This is pretty much all I need to do with this particular object. I just want to add some smoothing, so I'm going to activate the smooth option and then activate auto smooth. And then I'm going to change the angle to 30 degrees. I'm just going to check around the object. I think that's pretty much okay. Okay, so now I can go out of my local view and work on the next section. Before I begin beveling and smoothing this object, I want to add some cylindrical shapes to represent the pivot objects. I'm just going to go back to the concept. I've got this kind of beveled cylinder shape here with a rivet in the center, and I've got this simpler cylindrical shape here as well. So I'm going to add those in first. I'm going to go into edit mode and then face mode, and I want to select this circular face and then press Shift S to move my cursor to its center. Then back in object mode, I'm going to press Shift A and make a new cylinder, and I'm going to align it to my view and go into wireframe. And I want to make this much smaller, so I'm going to change the radius to, let's try 0.1. And if anything, I think that's a bit too small, so I'm going to increase that to 0.13. Yeah, I think that will do. And now I want to reduce the vertices count to 12. And if I look at it in an ortho view, the cylinder is very deep, so I'm going to change its depth to 0.1. So I think that will do, but half of the object is still buried inside this armature object. So I'm going to go into edit mode and wireframe, and I want to select the face at the back. And sometimes in these situations, especially in wireframe view, I find it quite difficult to make the selection that I want. I quite often misclick, and instead of selecting this face like that, I'm accidentally selecting one of the faces at the sides or somewhere that I don't want to select, basically. So in these situations, I find it useful to switch off the manipulator, and I can do that down here with this icon in the toolbar. And if I switch it off, it gives me a clear view of the dot that makes up the center of each of these faces, and I can do an accurate selection. So with that selected, I'm going to snap this face to the front of this armature object. So I'm going to press G, Y, and then hold Control and snap it to one of the vertices here. And now I don't need that face anymore, so I'm going to press X and delete it. The next thing I'm going to do is select the face at the opposite end of the cylinder and then poke that into triangles with Alt and P. And before I shape this now into my bevel shape that I need, I'm going to duplicate this object and place it over here ready for my next pivot object. So I'm going to go back to object mode and then front view, and I'm going to go into wireframe. Then I'm going to press Shift D and then X, and then I'm going to snap it with Control to one of the central vertices in this circular area at the other end of the object. So with that done, I'm going to go back into object mode and select my original cylinder and go into edit mode. And I want to scale these faces down, but at the moment I'm set to use 3D cursor as my pivot, so I'm going to change my pivot back to median, and now I can press S and then just scale that down to something like that. And looking back at the concept, I do have extra details here. I've got this circular shape, but I'm probably going to add that in the texture. I'm not going to add everything as geometry. So back in Blender, I'm going to apply some smoothing to this. And in this situation, I don't really want to use the auto smooth, because when I smooth these different objects and then combine them together, Blender will only use one auto smooth value for each object. So if I end up using different values, when I combine them, I will lose my smoothing. So I want to mark sharp edges in this case. So I'm in object mode and I can click the smooth button and then go back into edit mode and edge mode, and then I want to alt and right click the edge loop going around the edge of this surface here, and then press Ctrl E and then mark sharp. And then back in object mode I can go to my data context and enable auto smooth, and now I've got a sharp edge. So for the next cylinder, all I really need to do with this one is apply some smoothing and scale it. So I want to scale it in the Z and the X axis and lock out Y scaling. So I'm going to press S and then Shift Y and then just scale that down to, I think about there will do. And next I'm going to apply smoothing and then go into edit mode, and I want to select this edge loop around the end of the cylinder, so I'm going to alt and right click on that edge and then press Ctrl E and then mark sharp. So back in object mode, in my data context, I'm going to enable auto smooth. Okay, for the main body of the object, it's symmetrical, so I want to delete half of it and make my changes on the other half and then mirror that later. So first of all, I'm going to go into edit mode and then drop my current selection and then hover over this area on the left and press L to select linked, and then I can press X and delete those faces. Next I want to go back to object mode and then isolate this object in my local view, and then back in edit mode I want to start stripping away some of these edges. I don't really need them anymore, so I'm going to select these edges in the center on both sides and then press X and dissolve them. And now I want to break up these n-gons by connecting these vertices top to bottom. So I'm going to go to vertex mode and select two of the vertices and then press J to connect an edge between them. And I'm going to do the same for the rest of these vertices and just work around the object. Okay, with that done, I want to select these main edges that go all the way around the object. So back in edge mode, I'm going to alt and right click and then shift and alt and right click and add to that selection. And then I can bevel them with Ctrl B. I think something like that. And again, as before, because I've modified the topology, it's made the bevel turn out a bit uneven, so I can switch off my loop slide option here and that straightens that up. And now I want to select the edges that make up the bevel and then mark them as sharp. So I'm going to alt and right click and then press Ctrl E and then mark sharp. And I also want to select these edges here and mark those as sharp. So I'm going to alt and right click and do that on both sides. And I want to deselect the edges here in the center of the object, so I'm going to go into wireframe and then press B and then middle click to remove them from the selection, and then do the same on the other side, and then press Ctrl E again and mark those as sharp. So back in object mode and solid view, I've now got my sharp edges set up, so I can click the smooth button and then enable auto smooth. Okay, with that done, I'm going to go out of my local view and I want to combine these objects together. So I'm going to select the cylinders and then the main object and then click the join button. And now I want to mirror this geometry across the y-axis. So I want to use my 3D cursor as my pivot point. So I'm going to change my pivot point to 3D cursor and then bring my 3D cursor back to the origin of the scene by pressing Shift C. And with that done, I can go back to edit mode and then press A to drop my current selection and then A to select everything else. And then I can press Shift D and duplicate the faces, but then right click and leave them in place. With that done, I can press Ctrl M for mirror and then press Y and enter. And as before, with mirroring geometry, it flips the normals. So I'm going to press Ctrl and F and then flip those back the other way. So looking at it in object mode, I think that's looking pretty good. For the next section, I'm going to select the object and then put that into my local view. And I'm not going to do much to this. I just want to remove these faces at the ends of the cylindrical shape here. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then face mode and select them. And then delete them. And that exposes this interior face here. So I'm going to select that and do the same. And I think that will do. So I'm going to go back into object mode and apply my smoothing. But I want the edge around the cap of this cylinder to be a sharp edge. So I'm going to enable auto smooth and I'm going to choose a lower angle. Let's try 45. And that smoothed most of the edges off. There's some sharp edges still though. So I'm going to change the angle again to, let's try 50. And yeah, I think that's okay. And later on I'll be adding some more detail to the end of this strut, but I'll do that when I create the attachment objects. So I'm going to bring back the rest of the armature and I'm pretty much done with that now. So now I'm going to bring all of my objects back with Alt and H. And the next thing I want to do is duplicate these horizontal struts and create vertical versions which connect these two torus objects together. And I also want to create copies of these joint objects. So what I'm going to do first is select the joint object and the strut object and then the torus objects. And then I'm going to press Shift H to hide everything else. And before I begin, I want to move the origins for some of these objects around. So I'm going to select the horizontal strut and you can see the origin is there currently and I want it to be in the center of this edge loop at the end. So I'm going to go into edit mode and edge mode and then select that edge loop and then press Shift S and move the cursor to the selection. So back in object mode, I'm going to press Shift, Control, Alt and C and then choose Origin to 3D Cursor. So for the joint object, I'm going to do something similar, but I want to set the 3D cursor to be in the center of the cross section for this torus. So what I'm going to do is select the torus and I want to select the edges in the center. But if I go into wireframe view, it can be a bit difficult to see. I'm just going to see if that works. Let's go into edit mode and then drop my selection. And if I alt and right click that edge loop, now it gets confusing. So what I'm going to do is go back into object mode and then bring that object into local view. So if I go back to this edge loop here, the one I want to select, I'm going to drop my selection and I'm going to tab into edit mode and then right click and select that edge loop. And then back in object mode, I can go out of local view and bring these objects back so that when I go back into edit mode, I have my selection. So with that done, I can press Shift and S and move the cursor to that selection. And then back in object mode, and I'll do this in solid view, I want to select this joint object and move the center so that it matches up with the 3D cursor. So I'm going to press Shift, Control, Alt and C again, and then choose Origin to 3D Cursor. So with that done, I want to move my 3D cursor again to be in the same sort of position on the torus, but on this lower torus. So what I'm going to do is tab into edit mode, and I've still got this edge loop selected from some point earlier on, and so that's useful. So I'm going to press Shift S and then choose cursor to selected. And now back in object mode, I can select my horizontal strut and my joint object and then duplicate them and right click and leave them in place. and then I can press Shift S and then choose Selection to Cursor. So the joint object is in pretty much the right place, and the strut is poking out this way. So what I want to do is go into my front view with that selected, and then press R, -90, and rotate it so it's vertical. So I'm going to move this up so that it's just overlapping the lower joint object, and then in edit mode and wireframe, I'm going to go into vertex mode for this. I want to drop my selection and then select the vertices at the top, and then I can just move those up. I'm going to go back into solid view so I can see what's going on a bit better, and I'm just going to have them overlapping the top joint object a little bit. Okay, so with that done, I want to duplicate these objects and rotate them around the torus. So if I bring back my other objects, I'm going to go into object mode and then press Alt H. I already have the joints and struts on the top there, so I just want to select the vertical strut I've just made and this lower joint I've duplicated, and now I want to rotate them around the origin of the scene, and at the moment my 3D cursor is up here, so I want to press Shift C to bring that back to the origin, and I'll do this in top view and wireframe. So I want to press Shift D to duplicate, and then press R, -123.75, and then I can press Shift R to repeat that process. And then back in my ortho view and solid mode, you can see I've now got my struts lined up with all of the other joints from before. Looking back at the concept, these lower joint objects that I've just made and these vertical struts are actually placed roughly in between each of the armatures. So going back into Blender, I want to select those objects and rotate them around. But I want to rotate all of the struts and joint objects and also the central column. So what I'm going to do is select all of those struts and joints at the top as well. And then lastly, I'm going to select the central column object. And now I can parent those to that central column with Control and P, and then choose Object. And before I begin my rotation, if I select the central column object, I've got some rotation values here, so I'm going to press Control A and then apply my rotation, so that goes back to 0. And then with that done, I'm going to go into my top view with 7 on the keypad and go into wireframe, and I need to rotate this whole group of objects half of 123.75. But instead of working out the values myself, I can get Blender to do it for me. So in my rotation field for Z, I can type in 123.75 and then divided by 2. So it works out that number for me and puts it in the Z rotation field. And if I go back into my ortho view, I've now got the struts and joints nicely in between each of these armatures. With that done then, I want to rotate the lower torus so that the divisions on the top and the bottom torus match up. But if I was to select this torus and then move it around, it's going to take my armatures with it, and it will rotate the armatures as well. So what I'm going to do is select the upper part of each of these armatures and then press Alt and P and then clear their parent. So now I can select the torus, and I'm going to go back into my top view again, and I'm going to change the Z rotation value to 123.75 divided by 2. And now if I look here in my ortho view again, the divisions and how they relate to these joint objects is the same on the bottom as it is on the top.
Hi, ADWarriors here, just wrapping it up. Many thanks to Martin for taking us through this chapter. Next time we'll be taking a look at finishing the machine attachments, and then there's only one more chapter left after that to finish the whole modeling all off. So see you then.